Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Daniela Bleichmar, Professor of Art History and History at USC and Director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities. And today we are celebrating the publication of this wonderful book, The Angel in the Marketplace, by our colleague Ellen Wayland-Smith. And we have with us Maggie Doherty from Harvard University and Elaine Tyler May from the University of Minnesota, and our colleague Alice Echols will be moderating the conversation. The format is very simple. We will have our guests in conversation with the author for about 30 minutes, and then open it up for a more general conversation. So thank you so much for joining us. And Alice, maybe you want to get us going. Oh, and you're muted.
Oops, does she know she's muted?
Okay, so now, okay, good. So I'm really excited about this discussion. And one of the things that I would like us to be talking about today is biography writing. But I will get to that later. I think I certainly have my question at the ready for all of you. And it grows out of my own experience as a biographer of the rock star Janis Joplin. But I want to begin now by having Ellen, who has written this, yes, wonderful book, spend a few minutes talking about, what she sees as some of the most interesting kinds of interventions that she's making in it.
Yeah, so, well, I think, I thought I might begin just by giving a little bit of the story of how I came to write the book. Which was, I discovered Jean Rindlaub's archive in the course of writing my first book, which was about the Oneida community, which was a 19th century utopian experimental community in central New York. And they were sort of in the spirit of the radical 1940s. They were a socialist, Christian millenarian, free love community. So sort of jamming a lot of things together that didn't necessarily work together. And they, but also happened to be really good at capitalism. And so they started a trap manufacturing business. And when they sort of dissolved as a religious community, they sort of, without missing a beat, turned themselves over and became the foremost purveyors of silverware, Oneida Limited silverware, to America's, anxious rising middle class housewives. And so Rindlaub was actually hired to do their wartime advertisement, Oneida Limited's wartime advertisement, and she really sort of hit the ball out of the park for Oneida by designing these back home for keeps ads, which were these very sort of cloying advertisements, promising a return to sort of domestic bliss and peace after World War II. So that's how I found her. And in the course of researching my first book, I, had become sort of well-versed in this symbiotic relationship that capitalism and Protestant theology have always entertained with one another in our country's history. And also the sort of strange ways, the strange forms that it can take. In the beginning, the Oneida community was using capitalism to sort of fuel their Christian millennial utopia. And then they just as easily pivoted and became very sort of buttoned down and proper, corporate types when the need suited them. So what interested me about Jean Rindlaub's archive was that here I could take a look at this sort of ongoing relationship between capitalism or economics and theology through the lens of gender, that she and her advertising work really allowed me to see how the crafting, the very deliberate crafting of sort of an image of ideal domestic white femininity was part and parcel of this larger sort of world building enterprise of sort of creating an economic and political ecosystem where small government, free market boosterism, and evangelical Christianity all sort of blended together in the very potent mix that, sort of started in the sort of, crystallized in the 1940s and 50s, but which the fallout of which we're still obviously dealing with today. So I guess I wanted it to be, it was a look at the life and times of this woman, and but much more than a biography, because as Elaine noted, there's very little in the archive about her private life. She remained a private person, and even though there's a few letters and sort of personal things here and there, mostly the archive is just about her work. So the book was intended less as a biography and more as sort of a microhistory, a way of just looking at these sort of larger cultural and economic and theological permutations in the country, but through the lens of gender, to see how they sort of work together. That's a long-winded answer, but yeah.
So should we move towards some commentary? Either from, I don't know if Elaine, if you would like to go first, or Maggie, who wants to step in and start? Elaine?
She can't unmute.
Yeah, it's the problem that I had with trying to unmute.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, first, I just want to say how much I really enjoyed this book. It's a great read. I think using this one very interesting person as a lens into her era was really beautifully done, and it's beautifully written, and I really, really enjoyed it. I just found it fascinating. And it raised a number of questions for me. Maybe I can just toss out a few of the kind of general overarching questions I had.
Yeah.
And, Ellen, if you want to just pick
Sure.
a question to answer. You did so much with someone who was such an enigma. She just refused to reveal herself.
Right.
And therefore, using her as a kind of mirror, I think worked really effectively. And, you raised the point in the book that she was both reflecting and generating
Right.
a certain kind of middle class gender ideal of the post-war years, white, gendered ideal.
Uh-huh.
And so one question I had was about how you see that balance. How much do you think she reflected? And how much do you think her work in advertising actually had an impact?
Right.
And affected the way women saw themselves, saw the market, saw advertising.
Right.
She was a crusader for advertising, and I thought that was fascinating.
Right. Right.
Another question I'll just
Yeah.
just toss out, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later. But, it was remarkable at the end of the book to see this, transformation.
Mm.
And I guess that reflects back on the first question I had, which is how much of what she did in the world was she like a sponge absorbing
Right.
and then kind of putting it back out there in her own very dramatic way.
Right.
And how much really was she generating, because she was so open to the social movements of the 60s and
Right.
came on board actually quite early.
Yeah.
Relative to other white middle class women.
Right. Right.
So, I should just stop there because those two questions are related, and they, they're both at the heart of the book.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that was interesting about her, is that she, and so I trace in the book how, starting in the 19th century with the domestic ideology, right, and the sort of the split between home and work, and the way in which women were elevated as the angels in the house, and sort of given this moral authority over the household and over the family. That beginning with that sort of movement, there were always two paths that women who wanted to exert a moral influence could take. And one of them was looking outward, right? And doing what was called at the time community housekeeping, right? So instead of just keeping their own house and staying within their own four walls, they looked outward and they saw the society at large, whether they're local communities or the nation or the globe, as the sort of field where a maternal influence needed to be exerted, right? So, you have your sort of early social worker pioneers in the 19th century. You think of Jane Addams at Hull House, and the sort of women who went out and actually devoted themselves to trying to exert a maternal, sort of Christian influence. At the time, they saw themselves as sort of part and parcel of, a sort of humanitarian Christian movement. And they really thought there was a place for women in public life, right? That women should work in tandem with government, with institutions, to make sure that the bounty of the new industrial order was being equally partitioned. So you had these sort of outward-looking women who really saw a place for women in the public sphere as and who believed that women were a softening, a civilizing, a sort of Christian moral influence that needed to be there to counteract the sort of harsh, rough and tumble competitive capitalism that was the sphere of men. So you had that. And then on the other hand, you had the women who were very much inward looking and thought of their homes as their castles and their own moral castles that they had to protect from the outside, right? And there you have this whole tradition of women sort of looking to keep the state, who saw the state and intervention of the state in family affairs as a threat, right, to their moral domain, and looking very much to sort of keep the state and what they would call the nanny state, right, at bay, so that they could retain moral control over their family. In the sort of traditional sense of, woman belongs in the home and she belongs in this domestic family role. So I think what's interesting is that with Jean, these two, the sort of like a path diverged in the woods in the 19th century, but the two sort of branches of, how should women make their moral force felt were always, sort of bleeding back into each other at times, right? And so for Jean, she originally thought, here's the way. She originally had a conservative view of, woman's role, that a woman was subordinate to men and she should first and foremost be a wife and mother, but that she did have this, sort of duty to make a better world, whatever that meant. And by that, she meant very sort of blandly and vaguely, helping the poor, making people more equal, making people happier. But she thought for a long time, as many did, that the way to do this was just through trickle-down economics, right? That if she just spurred women to consume and to consume smartly and to keep the sort of wheels of capitalism running, she was doing her feminine duty in keeping the mechanism working that would eventually sort of, it was a tide that would eventually raise all boats. And what happened when she retired was that she suddenly was sort of thrust out of this, Madison Avenue world where she could believe in the idea of trickle down and the sort of moral influence that she was exerting by getting people to buy. And she suddenly saw that it wasn't working, or, that there were blind spots in the theory that, just consumption and just sort of the capitalist machine would sort of do its own work, right? So in a way, I see her as, having been, having these two sort of seeds of, what the woman's moral place was always within her, and they just sort of expressed themselves at different points in her life and in different ways. I don't know if that answers your question about how she turned to it. I think, I think she always had, I think she was absolutely sincere in her desire to make the world a better place for people, right? To sort of do, and she was a devout Christian, and she had this sort of general, even though she had this very prosperity gospel father, she had this general idea that, a Christian's duty was to help their neighbors, right? And she really bought into the idea that the best way to do this was through capitalist consumption, right? That you would create a powerhouse of goods and services that would eventually, raise everybody's living standard. And this was somehow, the Christian kingdom come. And I don't think she was ever, I really don't think she was cynical about that. I think she believes that that's what she was doing until, the 60s happened and she was sort of proved otherwise.
Right. Yeah. And she suddenly discovered there were all these other people in the world who she
Right.
wasn't really speaking to through her
Exactly.
work. Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, it's interesting. Can I just hop in? I mean, it did seem as though some of that transformation was connected to the experience of her own daughter.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I mean, at least it seemed from it. I mean, that struck me as I was reading your book.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, I do think, and I wish there had been more material there about her relationship with her daughter. I mean, they clearly had a very close relationship, and her daughter Anne was, in fact, the one who kept all of the material after her mother's death and who donated it to the Schlesinger in 2012. So they did have a close relationship, and yeah, I think she herself had never gone to college and had never tried to sort of pursue an academic career, obviously. Her daughter went to Radcliffe and, as was often the case in the 1950s, married while she was in college, had children while she was in college, but afterwards wanted to go to graduate school and found it impossible to sort of do the two things. And I think even though, Jean had always, been a sort of very vocal proponent of, the two-job woman, as she called her. She always said, women, if you just want to enough, you can have a family and a job too. But I think there she really saw her daughter struggling and, began to understand this is a problem.
Yeah. Maggie, did you want to?
Sure. Sorry to leap in. Thank you, Ellen, for this book. It's so interesting. And I also have some of the questions about method and how do you write about someone whose personal and public life are so intertwined or so hard to separate. But I just wanted to pick up on what you were saying about this public service or outward facing aspect of Jean, because it strikes me as so different from the method that she was, or the message she was selling to women, right? So it seems like the messaging of her advertisements was so often your home, and especially in the 50s, especially post-war, your home is the site where you can make a difference.
Right.
Which is really different than what you're sort of describing as this more service-oriented, public-oriented, the thing that Jean sort of embodied or grew up on, that actually as a woman, you have a moral duty to serve, not just your family, but your community, your church, what have you. And so I'm wondering, was that a tension at all for her, or is that just a historical shift in the way that people were thinking about women and service and women and sort of doing good? Is that simply, the shift from the 20s and 30s to the 50s, or where the site of where a woman makes a difference seems really interestingly different between those two places?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think, she was, even as she was raising a family and working, her job on Madison Avenue, she was also still always involved in service to her local community chest, her church she was involved in, and just, her general sort of speaking tours. She would give these, these talks to women, to women's groups. And so her, even though the volunteering became sort of, and the political sort of activism became her main focus after she retired, she was always doing it anyway, right, alongside her job. I don't, it's an interesting point, whether she saw that as something, getting involved in. I think that the idea for her was that these volunteer activities, and often the ones that she was involved in, like the church group, the women's church groups and so forth, those were still, because they were kind of local and all women, they still sort of fell under the umbrella of domestic, right? It wasn't yet, they weren't usually politically, oriented. And so I think she could still sort of, she could still sort of couch volunteer work of that sort as properly within the, the domestic frame of the, the housewives family. I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, well, it's just such a different, you know, you have these wonderful examples of she's doing her market research and
right.
women are saying that they're bored, they need diversion. And it's just such a different message to say, well, you should maybe wrap a banana in a piece of pork
Right.
versus, oh, you can, do something in the world, even if it's not sort of traditionally masculine,
Right.
professional, political achievement. Just the sort of turn inward is so striking that you
Right.
document.
Right. Yeah, and that's interesting because yeah, you're right. I mean, you would think that since she clearly, didn't find wrapping a banana in a piece of ham adequate for fulfilling what she thought was her feminine duty. So why she didn't sort of share those secrets that, she had a larger sense of duty, and she had her fingers in sort of other pies in terms of being an activist and doing community housekeeping. Yeah, that never sort of makes it into the advertising. And why she was able to sort of partition that off is an interesting question.
If I can ask another question, I have so many books sparked so many questions for me, and I guess one is about sort of that typical historian question, continuity and change. Because one thing that struck me as I was reading this book was how often when I'm teaching women's history or feminist history, I often talk about it as this kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, up and down, thing throughout the 20th century, that you have the 1920s, and there's sort of new possibilities for women. Oh, but then the Depression hits and it's illegal for women to work. Oh, and then the 40s comes and women are entering the workforce for these different reasons. Oh, then the 50s comes and, return to the home. But what was so striking to me was how when you look at this history through Jean's advertising and her perspective, it's so much more consistent. It's so much more, the heart tug advertising is sort of doing the same thing. The gender roles start looking much more similar across these different decades. And I guess I would just love to hear you talk a little bit about how writing this book and looking from this perspective changed the way you might have thought about that 20th century period, or sort of how continuous or discontinuous it looks when you're looking at it from this angle.
Right. Yeah, I think I too was sort of surprised when I went back in, because yeah, you do think of the 1920s as this time of sort of increased freedom for women, and yeah, this sort of push and pull back and forth. But I do think this sort of this underlying sense of a proper place for women and the sort of proper role that they should play, even when it's sort of opened up a little bit in places, is still very much in force across, from the 1920s through the, the sort of consolidation of this domestic feminine ideal in the 1950s. And I guess, I think what interested me too, or, what I found most interesting, one of the things I found most interesting was the way in which we tend to think of, the 50s model of this sort of private, inward-looking domestic housewife as a foregone conclusion, right? That it's sort of that's what the culture was leading towards. Was this again, this sort of resurgence of the Victorian angel in the house sort of figure. But when I was going through magazines from the 1930s and 40s, women's magazines from the 1930s and 40s, what really struck me was how open for debate it was, in terms of what the woman's role was going to be in being a community housekeeper. And so, by the time you get to Jean's 1950s advertisements with Betty Crocker and with R.C. Kohler, where she's literally just saying, if you feel upset about the state of the world and sort of injustice and poverty, just bake a cake. That's, that's one way. If you just feed your family, you're sort of doing the best you can to sort of make the world a better place. But if you actually look at a lot of women columnists who were writing in the Ladies' Home Journal, for instance, in the 30s and 40s, there was still very much alive this idea of community housekeeping as, lobbying the government for affordable housing for poor people, lobbying the government for better healthcare for workers. And I was surprised at, because that sort of falls out of a lot of the narratives, right? That this was still in the 1940s up until the post-war period when it just sort of disappeared. There was still very much in the women's magazines a sense that you weren't supposed to just stay within the four walls of your home. You were supposed to reach out and do these sort of concrete things to make your community or to make the nation a fairer, juster place. So I guess what does surprise me a little bit too is that given that Jean had never been averse to that kind of public maternal sort of role, and had always been a very sort of active person in her community in terms of being involved in alleviating poverty and those kinds of things. The fact that she was so easily sort of caught up in the privatizing narrative.
Yeah. It's so fascinating how all of those elements are present at any historical moment. So
right,
exactly.
Exactly.
Not a monolith. There's all of these things are happening at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think, not to monopolize, I think we should open it up to others, but I think Ellen and Maggie just kind of opened the door to this whole question of the complexity of her and her times. On one level, as I was reading, I almost was making a graph of, when she's like, what pages in your book were you looking at her affirmation and celebration of this domestic role? And then, there were these moments where, she talked about, on one level, she could say, well, sexual harassment is okay. You just have to brush it off, and unequal pay is okay because men deserve more. But then, she's critical. She talks about the kind of inconsistencies that she's facing in the world. And she brings that forward. She talks about the double life. She talks about herself as having both male and female perspectives on the world, that those were different, but they could be embodied in one woman, and that she saw the world in this way. And, on one level, she's celebrating these women who were full-time housewives. And then in another moment, she's calling them parasites.
Right.
So, she talks about the housewife role as drab and monotonous. I noticed, that was a quote you put in there. And at the same time, she's sort of saying this is what women should be doing. So on some level, she's kind of a transitional figure, but I think her own confusion comes out in the work that she did. And, that she's this white middle-class woman who universalizes that experience and then comes up very quickly in the 60s against a new reality that opens her eyes to the rest of the world.
Right.
I'll just throw out that one of the things I thought about when you were writing about Betty Crocker, and you had that chapter about the importance of Betty Crocker. I'm in Minnesota now, born and raised in Los Angeles, coming to Minnesota, a cultural, shift to a new planet.
Right.
But this is the home of Betty Crocker. Yeah. And there was an exhibit at my university on Betty Crocker that showed her transformation over time, because there is no real Betty Crocker. I didn't know that until I got here.
Yeah.
to say, but how she was pictured, literally, what women portrayed her, and how was her portrait shown, and how over time she becomes more racially ambiguous.
Right. Right. Interesting.
It's really kind of interesting. So I just throwing that out.
No, absolutely.
It's fascinating. Well, so should we open it up? Why don't we do that?
Sure.
And so you can raise your hand either physically, or you can use the little now yellow, I think, hand. Daniela.
Well, thank you. This is fascinating and, so far from anything I know about, but just really, really interesting to me. And one of the things that struck me, which came out or came up very, very early in our conversation was this tug between microhistory and social history, or the role of biography in it. So, you know, and one could approach it as a scholar and say methodologically, or one can approach it as a writer and say in terms of narrative, right? But for me, one of the things that was really interesting as a reader was this move back and forth between the individual experience and the larger picture, and the times when they sort of mesh very well, but also the times when it felt that they didn't. And I really enjoyed that as a reader. So I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about if your goal was, or if you conceive of this project as a microhistory, when your intentions and the biography align to use in a microhistorical way the case to tell a larger story, and when they didn't, and how you navigated that as a writer.
So when my intention to use her as sort of a lens in a micro history sort of coincided with the larger culture?
Well, I thought that a lot of the discussion that we've just had was about what elements in her story make sense to you, experience of the 20th century US. Which ones were sort of surprising because the individual scale and the larger historical or social or cultural scale don't quite mesh so much. And I wanted to hear from you, as you know, in your research, in your writing, when those tensions emerge, how you use them.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'll say, first of all, I was not trained as an historian. I have my PhD in French poetry, so French 19th century poetry. And, you know, I began writing history. You know, my first book about the Oneida community was actually in part a memoir, because my family founded the Oneida community. So it was, I've always approached my history writing from the perspective of sort of memoir biography, rather than you know, any particular sort of school of social, any particular school of historical writing, or, you know, social history versus microhistory. And so you know, personally, the way I sort of approach an historical figure is always to look at what that historical figure is doing and saying, and then where, I mean, this is just describing what microhistory is, right? But where that comes in, how that either makes sense or doesn't make sense given the sort of historical and economic and cultural milieu in which that person lives, right? So I guess, I mean, I think what happened with, in terms of writing this story, I went in thinking, without, you know, a sense of the full archive, I went in thinking this is going to be the story of a woman who wrestles with the tension between being a sort of corporate powerhouse, you know, a professional woman, and the fact that she's pushing, in her role as a professional advertiser, she's telling other women to stay home, that, you know, being a professional woman is not ladylike. And I thought that the story was going to be more about that sort of tension between, you know, how do you negotiate wanting to have this very sort of public, masculine, professional role, and you know, the content of what you're doing is giving another message. But the deeper I got into it, the more the less I was interested in that particular sort of personal struggle that she went through, which, you know, as I said earlier, that she doesn't leave a lot of sort of personal documents, you know, sort of telling us about what her own sort of interior process of coming to terms with that contradiction is. But the more I sort of looked into her history and the way in which she was raised and her father's sermons, it all, you know, I began to sort of understand her as a product of these forces. and a contradictory product, because even her father wrote these sermons for their church, which were, prosperity gospel 101. They sounded like Norman Vincent Peale before Norman Vincent Peale. And yet at the same time, he also had this kind of the seeds of this kind of progressive vision that, that the capitalism and this sort of economic mechanism that was taking off in America would be the sort of engine of a greater justice, of a better world. So I guess that's what I was always sort of focusing on in telling her story, is how these narratives, and these sort of competing ideologies, whether they're theological or historical or economic, always contain sort of seeds of other competing ideas, and how those competing ideologies get expressed or not, get, either fall into sort of ground that is propitious for their development or not. And so I think that's what I was trying to do with her, was to show how she had these two very different visions of what a sort of Christian a Christian approach to economics and to capitalism looked like, and depending on where she was and the sort of forces that were acting on her, one could come to the fore or recede, and then, and vice versa. I don't know if that answers your question.
Does anybody else want to raise a hand or pipe up? Well, I have a question, which is about writing biography / memoir. Years ago, I was working on Scarves of Sweet Paradise, which is a biography of the rock star Janis Joplin. And a friend of mine, another historian, was working on a biography of Harriet Stanton Blatch, who was the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. This was Ellen Du Bois. And she said, writing a biography is like having an affair with a married man. You only do it once. And it's true. I mean, I don't think that I would probably write another biography. Now, I know, Ellen, you see this as more of a microhistory, but in some sense, you're also describing your work as, especially in your first book, as sort of having real connections to memoir. So that's true of you. And I know, Elaine, that you have written about yourself as a memoirist as well as a historian, a thief of memoirs. And obviously, Maggie, you've written a collective biography. So I'm just interested in what your takes are, the sort of, if you, like me, in any way, feel sort of, if there's something about writing biography and memoir that is uncomfortable making. I know it is for me. I know that in a certain sense, as much as I enjoyed interviewing all of the people that I did for the Joplin bio, that for me was the most fun part in writing the times part. The life part was less fun for me because I felt as though there were parts of especially Joplin's inner life that I really felt was too much information, right? I didn't really want to know, and I certainly didn't want to write about. But I just am curious about that. How each of you feels about doing work that is in these genres of memoir or biography.
I would just say quickly that, when I was writing the Oneida book, because they were all my ancestors, I felt like I could say anything I wanted about them. I was like, this is fair game. They're my family. And, if I was interested in exploring their sort of personal the personal sides of their lives, as well as the sort of larger historical context. And I didn't give myself any sort of moral qualms about it, because I felt like I was entitled to it. When I
But
started,
you also didn't actually know them, right? These
Right.
were long since deceased, because it's a lot more problematical when you know them.
Exactly. And I did, for this one, right, suddenly I'm writing about the sort of personal life of a woman I don't know, and I'm thinking about her family. And I, in fact, spoke with the wife of her daughter died a while ago, and her wife is still living. And so I spoke with her wife, and I spoke with her son, and they're both in their 80s now. And they were, lovely and open, and, excited that this was coming to fruition. But, I felt, as I was writing about her, I think she comes out all right in the end, but along the way, I have some reservations about what she did, and the kind of work that she did, and the kinds of, the kinds of myopic visions of womanhood that she purveyed. And so that was uncomfortable for me. And so I'm not sure. I think you're right, Alice, when you say you'll do it once and not again. Doing it of my own family was one thing. Doing it of somebody else, and there wasn't even that much to work on in terms of the personal side, so I was sort of spared that. But yeah, what do the rest of you think?
Like I can chime in. I'm teaching a course on writing biography right now.
Oh,
wow.
And so it's all about these sort of theoretical concerns, ethical concerns. And of course, the first thing you learn is that everyone hates biography and everyone loves biography. So you read Virginia Woolf saying, life writing, terrible. Henry James is, going to foil all of his biographers, and, people are burning their papers. And at the same time, obviously people love biography. People keep writing it. People keep reading it. And so we've talked a little bit just about some of the ways that biographers try to make art and narrative and claim and interpretation while staying true to the facts. Although this is also not something that every biographer does. And I guess just as a kind of fun example, we just read part of Robert Caro's The Power Broker and part of Diane Johnson's.
Part of.
Yeah. And part of Diane Johnson's The True History of the First Mrs. Meredith. And they have such different ideas about how to do this kind of work. So, Caro says, basically show, don't tell. I'm going to give you these anecdotes about Moses. And from that, you're going to be able to feel, he's very interested in feeling. You're going to feel the sort of force of this scene. And then Johnson says, well, of course, the biographer has to be fundamentally a fiction writer and a psychologist, and has to make claims about especially people who are not as well known, who are not public figures. And so I guess, I'm answering this in part because I'm allergic to talking about myself and my own experience, turn outward. What have other people said? But I think, there's so many different approaches to this. And there's actually, I guess what I'm realizing in teaching this course is how the genre has so many genres within it, and how all the rules that you can lay out, Hermione Lee has this great book, An Introduction to Biography, and she has all these rules. And of course, all the rules are broken all the time. And so I think in some way that's very freeing. As anxious as I definitely got writing biographically, writing about real people with real families, seeing that sort of there's both no right way to do it, that it's always some form of betrayal in some way. This is Janet Malcolm's idea about it's always a betrayal, but also maybe that we just sort of embrace that in the name of trying to produce sort of knowledge and story and attention to things that we just think deserve attention, recover things that we think need to be recovered. And I think, Ellen, I think that's what you've really done so well in this book, is you've recovered a figure who, in some sense, like Moses, had this huge impact, and you have sort of the residue of her life. But the sort of, you also don't want to, you didn't falsify anything. You didn't imagine anything or sort of claim anything that couldn't really be claimed. I think that's kind of what everyone is wrestling with when they're writing in this mode.
Yeah. I tried not to sort of make the life fit some sort of narrative that I had going in. I tried to sort of follow it where it led me. And I think that's all you can sort of ask of the biographer, right?
I mean, I think some people would ask more, which is sort of interesting. Often, I don't know how the rest of you have had this in terms of reception, but sometimes readers will be disappointed with the way someone was. And they'll think, well, I think it's not great for women to be this way, or I think the right way for someone in this position to be is this way. And I was so upset to read your book. I thought, or just, I think this is a common response, right? That I believe that, working class women behave this way. Your biography tells me about a working class woman who doesn't, and that's very upsetting.
Right.
And I think this is I think that's something that probably does even inform the writing of a project like this, sort of knowing what readers' expectations are or ideas. So yeah, I think it's a real struggle.
Mm-hmm.
I actually had a follow-up question. Do you want to go ahead?
No, I was just wondering if Elaine wanted to jump in, just because she is somebody who has described herself as a memoirist. And I don't want to let you off the hook here.
I described myself as a memoir thief.
Yes.
Yes,
It's
I'll
true.
try and make this quick because I know we're running out of time and I want to hear from everybody. But I just had a really wonderful experience co-organizing a year-long series on memoir and history with a colleague of mine, Patricia Hampel, who's probably the most distinguished person in the humanities in my college. She's a MacArthur Genius Award winner and all of that. And she's a very, very famous memoirist. She's written many memoirs. Some of you may know her work. But so we did this together on memoir and history. And it was really fascinating. And one of the things that I learned is that the memoir can occupy a space between history and fiction. And a very famous memoirist who I will not out here, who came in our series, confessed, or just not even confessed, openly discussed the fact that he wrote a memoir, but he found it to be too busy. And so he just erased his brother.
Yeah. Oh, this isn't unusual.
Yeah.
Well, I thought it was, because I didn't know anything about that kind of thing. And, so just hearing how memoir writers went about doing their work. The other quick anecdote I want to tell, and this isn't from the series, we did do this collection of essays that came out of that series, which was really, really interesting. And I learned so much. But someone who was not part of that, another West Coaster like many of you are, and I don't think she'd mind me telling this story, is Estelle Friedman. And some of you may know Estelle's work. And one of the things that she did is a biography of a woman prison reformer by the name of Miriam Van Waters. Now, it's a wonderful book. And she had to do a lot of digging around because Miriam Van Waters was red-baited in the 50s. And her lesbianism was a piece of her, making her a suspicious character, not only the way she handled her, she ran a women's prison and, treated the women there like her students or her, it was very revolutionary at the time. But what really got her into trouble was when she was being accused of kind of communist sympathies, being sort of leaning red. And she wrote in her diary at one point that she had to burn, as she put it, she had to burn all the letters.
Yeah.
And Estelle assumed from that these were the letters that she had exchanged over many years with her lover, who was a married woman who was having this surreptitious affair with Van Waters. And all of that is in the book. What's not in the book is this wonderful story that Estelle tells about how she knew that this was a lesbian relationship, but because the letters were burned and the diary said, I burned all the letters, she was going to have a very hard time being able to make the claim. So she actually went to see, at this point, the grandchildren of Miriam Van Waters with great trepidation, because she didn't know how they were going to respond to her question. But she went to see them with the name of the woman that Estelle assumed was her lover. And she just went to see them and said, you know, I'm writing a biography, and you know, she had a friend who appeared quite a bit in her papers. I wonder if you ever heard of her and would know anything about her. And so she said the name of this woman she was quite sure was Van Waters' lover. And she said that the grandchildren all looked at each other very kind of out of the corners of their eye, and then looked back at her and they said, "Are you talking about grandma's yum yum?" That's one of my favorite biography stories of how you have to kind of hunt around to find the kind of truths that you suspect are there, but are not really in the written record. And those of you who do memoir writing, I have such admiration for your abilities to dig around. And Ellen, you know, the way you managed to portray a woman who was so careful not to reveal anything about herself, right, through the way she did reveal herself, I thought was really masterful.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I think Corey, you had a hand up. Oh, no, we have time. We have 6 minutes.
Okay, the reason I actually had a follow-up question for Maggie, and I want to give the last 6 minutes to Ellen, but maybe this can be a question for anyone who teaches biography or memoir or other kinds of writing that engage in historical recovery. We've had this long conversation just now about feeling a sense of responsibility toward living ancestors, descendants, people who have a stake in a person's reputation, but also this need to be, you know, for fidelity to the historical record and to whatever argument you're trying to make. And I'm just curious to know if college students enrolling in these classes today share that same hesitation, especially given that so many people are now broadcasting their lives via social media. You know, we're surrounded by this living archive, and you know, every day brings us another gleeful celebrity who's been canceled for having said something that's at odds with what their persona might suggest. And so I just wonder if some of these concerns are generational, and if they continue to be as pressing for young folks today who experience the boundary between sort of public and private life somewhat differently.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. But having never taught biography to my students, I'm not sure I'm going to answer it, Maggie.
Well, you teach writing though, right?
I do teach writing, and I've been wanting to get a course together on, you know, sort of life writing and get them into the archives, but I haven't done it yet.
I guess I just wonder, I mean, maybe do you think that in your students, do you see similar sort of concerns around privacy in their writing? I mean, are they very open about writing about themselves? Mm-hmm. Are they, you know, conscious of sort of boundaries that they shouldn't cross in their writing, or as Corey is sort of smartly suggesting, is that not as much of a concern for them?
I mean, I think certainly they're more forthcoming about their own, you know, private lives. And, you know, I certainly in my classes sort of encourage this sort of, you know, cross-pollination between private experience and, you know, sort of public argument, the way in which your own private experience can, you know, not be used as evidence, but can certainly be sort of, you can bring it into you can bring it onto the page as a way of either framing or, you know, corroborating your larger argument. So, you know, I think my students do, you know, don't shy away from sharing it, you know, sharing sort of personal things. But when it comes to, you know, would they feel comfortable sharing, you know, sort of making claims about other people who are living and publishing those claims, I'm not sure I have an answer to that.
Daniela,
because I think that this is a really interesting question, and of course always there's an interesting question 2 minutes before time is up, but it strikes me that there's two related issues, and one is the relationship between the public and the private, which you have all talked about, but also something that you have all talked about is the, I don't know if I want to say ethical, but the role that for all of you as writers, evidence plays in telling a story. And you have all talked about what you found or didn't find, or how, what you could do with the facts. And I think that is another aspect that is very unstable today, the relationship between facts and claims. So I wondered if that was part of this conversation too, not just what you feel comfortable or not comfortable sharing about someone else or about yourself, but also the basis for statements that are made.
And if I could just piggyback on that, I feel that another thing that's in tension, because I don't teach memoir, but I do teach the personal essay. And so that's a place where students are being asked to reveal themselves. And something that I think is a division that's less clear for students than it might be for us is the difference between followers and an audience. You know, and I have to kind of talk about like just telling us that this thing happened like it's a, you know, an Instagram story isn't really what the form is about, right? Like you have to conceptualize audience as a different body of people with a different set of interests. So yeah, I think facts and evidence, audience versus followers, like these are all up for grabs right now.
God, I'd never even thought about that. Audience versus followers. Oh.
Well, if that is not a depressing note on which to end, we are at time, and I know that it flew by. Thank you so much to Elaine and Maggie for joining us in our conversation about Ellen's book, and thank you to Alice. You were much more than a moderator. So thank you, everyone, and you know, if you haven't already, go read this book.
Yes.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Congratulations, Ellen. It's a wonderful book.
Oh, thank you so
Yes.
much. It's a
Thank
pleasure.
you so much for including me. I really enjoyed this. I loved the book and I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. It was an honor. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.